The smell reached Mara Voss before anything else did. It came through the car window as she turned off Route 9 onto the unmarked county road. A slow, green rot, the kind that had been composting itself for years without anyone's permission, damp wood and old paper, and something beneath both of those things. Something mineral and black like creek water in November. She was 27 years old, and she had $214 left in her checking account, and she was driving toward a building she had never seen to collect an inheritance she did not yet understand from a great aunt she had met exactly once, at a funeral for someone else. When Mara was 11 years old, the road narrowed. The oaks on either side had grown together overhead, in the manner of things that have been left alone long enough to do exactly as they please. The afternoon light came through in pieces, sharp-edged, amber, slanted, and in the shadow between the trees the air turned cool against her forearm where it rested on the open window. Late September in upstate New York did not ask permission before it reminded you that warmth was temporary. The temperature dropped 3 degrees in 60 yards. She heard the building before she saw it. A sound like wind moving through a bad seal somewhere. A low, rhythmic complaint from a structure settling under its own weight, the way old buildings breathe when no one is watching. She slowed the car. The tree canopy broke, and there, set back from the road behind a collapsed iron fence and a yard that had not been mowed in any year she could identify, was the Harwick Municipal Library. It had been built in 1911 with money donated by a woman named Eleanor Harwick, whose name had been removed from the cornerstone at some point between 1938 and now, leaving a rectangle of paler stone where the letters had been. The building was 3 stories of dark Hudson Valley limestone, broad-shouldered and unsmiling, with a pitched roof that had lost perhaps a third of its slates and replaced them with nothing. The windows on the 2nd floor were boarded. On the 3rd floor, one window was still intact, its glass so old it had gone wavy, and through that glass, even from the road, something moved. A curtain, perhaps, or a shift in the air, though every door and window on the lower floors was sealed. The library had been condemned in 2019. The town of Harwick, population 2,341, had been trying to sell it ever since. 3 buyers had offered. 3 buyers had withdrawn. A 4th, a development company called Crestline Properties LLC, had purchased it 14 months ago for $1 as a tax consideration, with the stated intention of demolition. That intention had not yet been executed, for reasons that were not public. Mara Voss had inherited the library from her great-aunt Doris Fell, who had died in August at the age of 89 in a rented room 40 minutes south, leaving behind $1,100 in savings, a set of mismatched dishes, and a legal document that transferred to Mara, by name, all of Doris Fell's rights, interests, and associated materials pertaining to the Harwick Municipal Library property, including but not limited to whatever may be found therein. She had shown the document to a lawyer in Albany, a man named Keswick, who had looked at it over his reading glasses and said, with very little warmth, that she would need to manage her expectations. The property was already sold. Whatever Doris Fell had believed she was leaving her great niece, the legal reality was more complicated. Mara had thanked him and not paid the consultation fee, because she did not have it. She sat in her parked car at the end of the collapsed fence and looked at the library. The building looked back. In the wavy glass of the 3rd floor window, the curtain, or the air, moved again. She had the key on the passenger seat. It was an old key, long and iron, with a bow cut in the shape of an H. It had been in the envelope with the legal document. Doris had left no explanation. Just the key, just the building, just the instruction in a handwriting that pressed hard into the paper. Go inside. Go all the way in. What was she about to find? The law offices of Galt, Tremblay and Doane occupied the top floor of the only building in Harwich taller than 2 stories, which was the Harwich Commerce Centre on State Street, a glass and steel structure that had been built in 2008 and still wore the aggressive cleanliness of something that had never apologized for displacing whatever stood there before. Mara had been there 3 weeks earlier, before she drove to see the library, before she had any reason to believe the inheritance was anything other than a cruelty dressed up in legal language. She had taken the elevator. The elevator had mirrors on all 3 walls, and she had been aware, as she had been aware her entire adult life, of what she looked like in rooms where she was not expected, not poor enough to be visibly dismissed, not polished enough to be visibly included, the perpetual middle distance between those 2 states. Her coat was clean but 6 years old. Her boots were resoled. She had $214 in her account when she pressed the button for the 4th floor, though it had been $419 2 weeks before that, before the August rent. The conference room smelled of coffee and cashmere and the particular quality of air that comes from recirculation systems maintained on a generous budget. There were 3 other people at the table when she arrived, all of them from a single family, the Crestline Doane family, which was to say Douglas Doane, 61, in a jacket that retailed for what Mara paid in rent, and his 2 adult children, Lena and Greg, who wore the unhurried expressions of people who had never had to decide between 2 things because they could always afford both. On Douglas Doane's left wrist was a Rolex Oyster Perpetual in steel and gold. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The lawyer, a man named Arlen Galt, read from the will. Douglas Doane and his children received the bulk of what their relative, a man named Robert Doane, Douglas's uncle, had left behind: a property portfolio appraised at $2.3 million, a savings and investment account totaling $847,000, and the deeds to 4 commercial buildings on Route 9. There were also 2 vehicles, a boat slip, and a wine collection. Then Arlen Galt turned to Mara. She received the key, and the document Doris Fell had already sent her, and a single line from Robert Doane's will, which Galt read without inflection. To Mara Voss, grandniece of my beloved friend Doris Fell, I leave what Doris already knows to leave her. Go together, girls, and do what we could not. The room was quiet for perhaps 4 seconds. Then Douglas Doane made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. He said, "A riddle," from a man with dementia. He did not say it to Mara. He said it to Arlen Galt, as though she were not in the room. I assume there's nothing actionable in any of that. Mara held the key in her lap beneath the table. It was heavier than it looked. The iron was cool at first, and then it was warm, and the H of the bow pressed a faint mark into her palm. She did not look at Douglas Doane. She looked at Arlen Galt, who was already shuffling papers, already pivoting to the next matter, already done with her portion of the afternoon. It was Lena Doane, younger, with the relaxed certainty of someone who has been correct about everything for so long she no longer bothers to check, who looked at Mara directly and said, with a small, particular smile, "You should keep the key. It's probably antique. You might get $40 for it at an estate sale." Mara closed her hand around the iron. The H pressed deeper. She said nothing. She stood. She left. In the elevator, alone, between the 4th floor and the lobby, she turned the key over in her hands. On the shank, almost invisible in the brushed iron surface, there was a marking she had not seen before, a number, 1911, and beneath it, a braided but legible, 3 letters that had not been mentioned in the will by Arlen Galt or by anyone in that room, RHF. She drove home and looked up Eleanor Harwick in every database she could access from her phone. Eleanor Harwick had married in 1909 a man named Samuel Fell. She drove back to Harwick on a Tuesday, 11 days after the will reading, because it took her that long to clear a shift at work, arrange for someone to feed her neighbor's cat, a duty she had agreed to in exchange for reduced rent, and save enough from tips to cover gas and a motel room she would not use if she could avoid it. The drive was 2 hours and 20 minutes on a good day. It took her 3 hours because she stopped once for gas and once because the sky above the Catskills had gone a color she had no word for. Not purple and not gray, but something between them that seemed to be deliberate. And she needed a moment to simply be a person looking at a thing. She had $67 when she arrived. The library in daylight was worse and better than it had been at dusk. Worse because the decay was more legible. She could see now that the front steps had partially collapsed on the east side, that the iron fence had not merely fallen but been torn from its moorings in 3 places, that the landscaping had not been neglected so much as strangled, the ornamental plantings of a more attentive era now consumed by the same green rot she had smelled on the first pass. A sign on what remained of the gatepost read "Condemned, IME Prohibid, Crestline Probimi LLC," in orange plastic, its corners already curling. Beneath it, someone had zip-tied a smaller sign, "Scheduled Demolition." Pending permit. Better, because in the morning the building wore its age differently. The limestone had been something remarkable once. She could see that in the proportions, in the carved panels above the windows that depicted women reading, women writing, women teaching. The carving was patient and expert. Someone had cared about this building. Someone had meant it to last. She stepped over the fallen section of fence. The ground was soft under her boots, the mud rich and cold, autumn mud that holds the shape of everything that touches it. She crossed 23 feet of collapsed garden. She counted paces out of habit, a thing she did in spaces she did not yet understand, and climbed the 3 intact steps to the library's front door. The iron key turned in the lock. It required both hands and a full quarter turn of resistance before the mechanism released. The door swung inward on hinges that had not been oiled in something measured in decades. A sound like a held breath finally let out. The smell hit her first, as it always did. Paper and time and a cold that had been insulated so thoroughly by stone walls and boarded windows that it existed inside the library as a permanent climate, unrelated to the season outside. Mold, but old mold. Not the aggressive black kind, but the gray, literary kind that forms on the edges of things when moisture finds paper, and neither of them has anywhere else to be. Dust so deep it had texture. Beneath all of it, something else. Something faint and sweet and wrong. Like dried flowers kept too long, or the particular scent of linen that has not been touched since the person who owned it stopped needing it. Her footsteps echoed. The main hall was intact. The shelves were still there, floor to ceiling, dark oak, running the full length of both side walls. Though most of the books had been removed, their absence leaving pale rectangles on the wood where they had once stood. The circulation desk was still in place, a massive piece of built furniture that could not have been removed without taking a wall with it. A card catalogue stood against the north wall, its small brass pulls tarnished to the color of old pennies. She almost left at the east stairwell. The stairs going up to the second floor were there, but the third step had rotted through, and beyond it 2 more were questionable, and above them the second floor landing was dark, the boarded windows allowing only thin gray lines of light at their edges. Everything smelled of structural uncertainty. Everything said, "Not worth it. Go home. You got $40 for an old key and that is the end of it." She stood at the base of the stairs for 31 seconds. She counted those 2. She stayed because of the card catalogue, specifically because of one drawer in the card catalogue, 3rd column, 2nd from the bottom, which was not tarnished, whose brass pull had been touched recently, whose edges, when she crouched and looked at them directly in the thin light, showed wear that was not old. Someone had been opening this drawer. Recently. Regularly. She pulled it open. Inside, in place of index cards, was a single folded piece of notepaper. In Doris Fell's hard-pressing handwriting, 4 words behind the shelves. North. The north wall shelf unit was identical to every other shelf in the room. Same dark oak, same proportions, same pale rectangles where books had been, except for one thing that Mara did not notice for 11 minutes, and only found because she began at the left end and worked right, running her hand along the back panel of each shelf bay, pressing at intervals, learning the wall's language through her fingertips. The other shelves sat flush to the stone. This one did not. Not all of it. Most of it was flush, correctly mortared to the limestone behind. But in the third bay from the right, at shoulder height, the back panel gave a fraction of an inch under pressure, not the give of rot. The give of something mounted to swing. She pressed harder. Nothing moved. She stepped back and looked at the shelf from 2 feet away. The bay was empty, like all the others. The top shelf, the bottom shelf, the 4 in between, all empty, all pale rectangled, all patient. But the second shelf from the bottom had a scratch on its left bracket that was not where. It was the mark of something repeatedly lifted and replaced. A small lateral scratch made by a hand accustomed to the motion. She lifted the shelf. It came out of its brackets in her hands. The whole plank, solid oak, perhaps 12 pounds, and what was behind it was not a wall panel but a handle. Cast iron, old, shaped like a half circle, set into the panel itself. She set the shelf down on the floor. She gripped the handle. The panel, which was not a panel but a door, resisted for a full 5 seconds of sustained pull before something internal released and it swung toward her, and the cold came out. It came out like a held breath from a room that had been sealed for a very long time. The space beyond was not large, perhaps 9 feet deep, perhaps 7 feet wide. She could see this even before she turned her phone flashlight on, because the cold itself had a shape, and the smell was immediate and specific, and unlike anything she had encountered, dry, perfectly, deliberately dry. The smell of paper that had been protected, the smell of cedar. She identified it a second later. Cedar planking on the interior walls, the old preservationists' technique, the thing wealthy people did in 1920 when they wanted something to last 100 years. Cedar and old wax, and beneath that the faint scent of machine oil, from a mechanism she would later understand was a humidity seal built into the door frame. She turned on the flashlight. The shelves in here were full, not books. Boxes, archival boxes, the kind made of grey acid-free board, labelled in ink that had faded but not disappeared, stacked with the deliberate care of someone who expected them to be found by someone specific. 3 shelves on the left, 3 on the right, and in the center a flat surface, a table essentially, built into the wall, with a single item on it, a tin box. Rectangular, roughly the size of a hardback novel, painted dark green with a small lock that had been left open. On the lid, in paint that had held its black against the years, EHF, private correspondence, not to be opened before necessary. The boxes on the shelves were labeled. She read them left to right, unhurried, because she was still in the stage of understanding that comes before urgency. Harwick Municipal Library, Deed of Covenant, 1911. Land Survey, Eleanor Harwick Fell, 1909 to 1924. Robert H. Doane, Letters, 1938 to 1941. Financial Records, Harwick Trust, 1911-1963. Eleanor Harwick Fell, Original Bequest Documents, Do Not Remove. She stood still for a long moment, the cold of the room pressed against her face, her hands, her collarbones. Her heartbeat was very steady. Later, she would think about that. How still her pulse was in the moment she understood what she was looking at. The stillness of someone who had been expecting something, even without knowing it. The stillness of someone who had been right the whole time. She opened the tin box. Inside was a letter. 3 pages, handwritten, in the formal and slightly elevated hand of a woman educated in the early 20th century, dated October 14, 1938. It began, "If you are reading this, you are who I hoped you would be, and I am sorry it took so long for the right moment to arrive. My name was Eleanor Harwick before I married Samuel Fell, and I built this library, and I gave it to this town, and this town took it from my name but could not take it from my family. What is in this room is the proof of everything." She read all 3 pages standing up, in the cold, by phone flashlight. She read them slowly. She read the parts that said the library had been built on land that Eleanor Harwick had purchased herself, in her own name, with money inherited from her mother, in 1909, before her marriage, when a woman could still hold separate property under New York law if she had been careful enough. She read the parts that said the Doane family. Robert Doane's father, Walter Doane, had forged the transfer documents in 1941 after Samuel Fell died, using Eleanor's grief and a lawyer who owed him a favor. She read the part that said the deed of covenant, the original and legally supreme document of the library's founding, was in the gray box labeled Deed of Covenant, 1911, and that it contained a reversionary clause that Eleanor had placed there deliberately, with the help of a title attorney in Albany who was not Walter Doane's man, which said, "In the event of any attempt to demolish or materially alter the Harwick Municipal Library structure, all land and property rights shall revert immediately to the heirs of Eleanor Harwick Fell, to be determined by direct blood descent." The last paragraph of the letter read, "I cannot tell you what the archive is worth, because I do not know what year you are reading this. I can tell you what it means. It means the land cannot be taken. It means the building cannot be touched. It means every record Walter Doane thought he buried is here intact, waiting. Take it all, use it all. Do not be quiet about any of it. I was quiet for too long and I lost years I cannot have back. You have been quiet enough." It was signed, with love and with anger. Eleanor. Outside, somewhere on the ground floor, a door opened. She knew the sound immediately for what it was. Not wind, not the building settling, because it was followed by footsteps, and footsteps have intention in a way that buildings do not. She eased the archive room door closed without latching it. The darkness was total. She stood with her back to the cedar wall and counted the footsteps as they crossed the main hall floor. 2 sets, both male, both moving with the deliberate casualness of people who have a key and a legal reason to use it. She heard a voice she did not recognize say, "She parked out front. Car's still there." She heard a second voice say, "Find her." The second voice belonged to Douglas Doane. She waited 90 seconds. She took the tin box and the original Deed of Covenant from its gray archive box and placed both inside her jacket, against her body. She took her phone and turned off the flashlight. She memorized the door handle's position in the dark. When she came out of the archive room, Douglas Doane was standing at the circulation desk with his hands in his overcoat pockets, and a man she did not know. Younger, with the compact energy of someone paid to manage situations, was at the base of the collapsed stairwell. Both of them turned when they heard the shelf door. Douglas Doane looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at the open shelf door. Then he looked back at her. "Ms. Voss," he said. He did not sound surprised. He sounded finished. He removed from his coat pocket a folded document. He set it on the circulation desk with the flat, unhurried motion of a man who has done this kind of thing before and found it uncomplicated. "New York State Municipal Property Code, Section 74B, he said. "Emergency demolition authorization. A condemned property with active structural deterioration can be cleared on an accelerated timeline when public safety is demonstrated. The permit was filed this morning. We have 72 hours. He paused. "Whatever you found in there, and I'm sure you found something, Doris always believed she was being very clever. It doesn't matter. The building and everything in it will be gone before any probate proceeding or adverse claim has time to be adjudicated. By Friday, the younger man moved to the shelf door and looked inside. "There's boxes," he said. "Leave them," Douglas Duane said, still watching Mara. "They'll go with the building." Mara looked at Douglas Duane. She looked at the document on the circulation desk, which she did not touch. She looked at the younger man, who had come out of the archive room and was now standing near the card catalogue. And she noticed that he had not touched the archive room door, had not catalogued its contents, had not taken a single photograph, that he was, in fact, treating the room the way his employer had probably always treated documents, as a category of problem rather than a source of information. Douglas Duane had spent his entire career buying things without reading them, she said. "I'll need 48 hours to assess the contents of the archive room." He made the same almost law as in the conference room, the same not quite surprise at her persistence. "You don't have 48 hours. You have 72, and the first 24 belong to us." She picked up her jacket from the shelf where she had set it, carefully, because the tin box and the folded deed were inside, and neither of them was weightless. And she looked at him with an expression she had been preparing her whole life without knowing it. "Then I'll need the night," she said. He shrugged, generous in the way of men who have already won. "Lock up when you leave," he said. She walked to her car. She drove to the motel she had not planned to use. She sat on the bed and called 3 people, the Albany title attorney, whose name she had found in Eleanor Harwick Fell's 1909 land purchase records, the current partner of the firm, a woman named Adese Okafor, who picked up on the second ring, a clerk of the New York State Supreme Court's Property Division, and a journalist at the Albany Times-Union named Keith Brewer, who covered municipal development, and who she had found during 11 days of research, written 2 previous stories about Crestline Properties LLC's acquisition practices. She laid the deed of covenant on the motel bed. The reversionary clause was on page 3. It was 37 words long. Adese Okafor filed the emergency injunction at 7:47 the following morning, before the Harwick County Courthouse opened, by fax and by hand delivery simultaneously, because she was the kind of attorney who understood that speed and redundancy are not the same thing but are equally necessary. The injunction cited the Harwick Municipal Library Deed of Covenant, dated March 3, 1911, recorded at the Harwick County Clerk's office under instrument number 1911-0047. Which Mara had found in the second grey archive box, certified original, with the clerk's seal still intact, and invoked the reversionary clause on page 3, which had never been contested, had never been removed, and had, as it turned out, never been read by Douglas Duane, his father, his lawyers, or any of the 3 buyers who had preceded Crestline Properties in attempting to purchase the library. The demolition permit was stayed at 9:14 a.m. by a judge in Albany who had, according to Adese Okafor, needed approximately 11 minutes to read the relevant clause and another 4 to understand its scope. Mara was at the library at 9:30. Keith Brewer from the Times-Union was there at 9:45 with a photographer. The photographer took pictures of the archive room, the archive boxes, the cedar walls, the tin box, and the letter from Eleanor Harwick Fell. He took a picture of the 1911 Deed of Covenant, open to page 3, with Mara's hand resting beside it. Not touching the document, just beside it, because Adese Okafor had been very clear about the chain of custody. Douglas Duane arrived at 10:20, ahead of his lawyer, which was the first sign that something had gone wrong in his information chain. He came through the collapsed fence the same way Mara had, and he stood in the main hall of the library, and his lawyer, who arrived 4 minutes behind him, still buttoning his coat, leaned in and spoke quietly into his ear for approximately 40 seconds. Douglas Doane looked at Mara. She was standing at the circulation desk, which she had cleared, and which now held an organized arrangement of documents from the archive room. The deed of covenant, the forged transfer documents, the financial records of the Harwick Trust, and the 41 letters between Eleanor Harwick Fell and Robert Doane's father, written between 1938 and 1941, in which Walter Doane had made several statements about the library transfer that would be described in the Times-Union piece published 48 hours later as an unambiguous written record of fraudulent intent spanning 3 years. Douglas Doane's lawyer said, in a voice carrying enough for the room, "The injunction appears to be valid. The reversionary clause predates the 1941 transfer, which means the transfer itself may be." "I know what it means," Douglas Doane said. He looked at the boxes. He looked at the documents on the desk. He had the expression, Mara thought, of a man seeing paper, actual paper, the paper he had always dismissed, the paper he had always assumed could be managed, buried, demolished, removed, as the thing it actually was, which was permanent. He said to Mara, because there was no one else to say it to, "You have no idea what you're getting into." She thought of Lena Doane's smile in the conference room, the $40 at an estate sale, the key that was probably antique. "The reversionary clause," she said, "runs with the land in perpetuity. The property reverts to the heirs of Eleanor Harwick Fell upon any attempted demolition. You filed the demolition permit. The clause has been triggered. The property is mine." She picked up the deed of covenant from the desk and held it by its edges, carefully, the way you hold something that has been waiting 90 years for a specific moment. "You bought this building for $1, Mr. Doane. I'm afraid you're getting exactly what you paid for." Keith Brewer wrote that line down in his notebook. Douglas Doane left without speaking again. His lawyer followed. At the door, his lawyer looked back at the archive room, at the boxes, the cedar walls, the tin box on the flat surface, with an expression that suggested he was already calculating what else was in there and how much of it was going to matter. All of it, Mara thought. All of it was going to matter. She stepped out of the library into the October light, and for the first time since she had pulled into this county road, with the smell of rot and the sound of an old building breathing, the sky above the Catskills was completely clear. The fraud case moved faster than these things usually do, which Adairs Okafor attributed to the quality of the documentary evidence and the completeness of the written record that Walter Doane, contemptuous, always of paper, had left behind. Douglas Doane was indicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to suppress evidence. He pled to 2 counts 14 months later and was sentenced to 27 months and a $340,000 fine. Lena Doane, whose role in the discovery of the archive's existence. She had hired a private investigator to track Mara's movements after the will reading, and the investigator's notes were in the younger man's jacket pocket when Adairs Okafor's process server found him. Resulted in a separate civil judgment of $218,000 against her personally. Greg Doane cooperated with the state and paid $94,000 in restitution. Crestline Properties LLC was dissolved by court order in the spring of the following year. Its 4 commercial properties on Route 9 were seized as part of the fraud recovery and auctioned, generating $1.87 million that went into a court-administered account whose disposition was determined, in part, by the heirs of Eleanor Harwick Fell. There was one heir. The Harwick Municipal Library was placed on the New York State Register of Historic Places in the summer following the legal proceedings, which meant that the preservation restoration that Mara Voss had already begun with a grant from the New York State Council on the Arts and a matching contribution from a private foundation that had read about the case in the Times-Union and decided it was exactly the kind of thing they existed to support, was now also eligible for federal historic tax credits. The library opened to the public again in the following October, 26 months after Mara had first driven down the unnamed county road with $214 in her account and an iron key pressing an H into her palm. The restoration had taken care to preserve the wavy glass in the third-floor window, and the limestone carvings of women reading and writing and teaching above the arched windows, and the card catalogue with its tarnished brass pulls, and the north wall shelf unit with its hidden door, which remained operable, and which visitors could open to see the cedar-paneled archive room, now climate-controlled and properly lit, where the boxes were still arranged on their shelves in the order Eleanor Harwick Fell had placed them. The cornerstone had been restored. The pale rectangle of absent letters had been filled. Eleanor Harwick Fell, 1911. On the evening of the reopening, after the last visitor had gone and the caretaker had locked the main door, Mara Voss sat at the circulation desk in the near dark, the way she imagined Eleanor might have sat at some desk of her own, in some room she had built and then lost, and then, through Doris, through paper, through a great-niece who had learned to count her paces and notice what had been recently touched, recovered. The smell in the room was cedar and old paper and cool stone, and underneath it now, faintly, something she had not detected before, the particular quality of air in a building that has been given back its purpose. Outside, the oaks had lost their leaves. The moon was up over the Catskills, and the library's limestone was silver in it, and the women carved above the windows held their books with the same patience they had always held them, waiting for the right reader to arrive. What Eleanor Harwick Fell had understood, what she had encoded in a deed and a letter, and a cedar room sealed against time, was that the most dangerous thing you can give a woman who has been overlooked is a record of what was taken from her. Not money, not property. A record. Something that does not require permission to be true. Mara Voss was 27 years old, and she had $214 in her account, and she had found it anyway. Eleanor hid the documents. Doris kept the key. Mara was the one who actually read everything, and that single act of attention changed everything. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. More are coming. Stories of women who were overlooked, underestimated, and quietly, completely right the whole time. Hit the bell. You won't want to miss what's buried next.